12 years of marriage, built on love and trust, shattered by something small. A detail so ordinary it should have meant nothing, yet it unraveled everything. If there's one thing you'd say about Claire, it's that she's a natural at making connections. She could turn a stranger into a confidant in minutes, always knowing the right thing to say. It wasn't just her looks, though those didn't hurt. Claire had this presence, a warm charisma that pulled people in, made them feel special. She made me feel special once, a quiet engineer who never thought he'd catch the attention of someone like her. Our story started simply enough, the way most love stories do. I met Claire at a mutual friend's wedding, of all places. She was in a flowing green dress that matched her hazel eyes, her laughter carrying across the room. I was the guy at the corner table, nursing a beer and hoping no one would try to drag me onto the dance floor. But then she came over, said something about the dullness of wedding speeches, and just like that, I was hooked. That's the thing about Claire, you don't realize you're falling for her until you're already too far gone. I used to think our differences made us stronger. She was the dreamer, the artist who saw beauty in chaos. I was the realist, grounded and precise, the kind of guy who had his life planned out 5 years in advance. Together, we balanced each other out. Over the years, we built a life that, to anyone on the outside, probably seemed perfect. We bought a house together a decade ago, a 1950s relic that had seen better days. The kind of place with peeling paint and floors that creaked with every step. I'll admit, I didn't see the potential Claire did, but she convinced me. Imagine the memories we'll make here, she'd said, standing in the overgrown yard with a hopeful smile. And she was right. It wasn't easy. That first year, we sank everything we had into fixing it up. Weekends were spent covered in dust and paint, working side by side to turn the place into something livable. Claire had the vision, while I handled the structural stuff. I'd come home after a long day at work to find her sketching ideas at the kitchen table, covered in sawdust, her excitement palpable. Those were good days, the kind you don't realize you'll miss until they're gone. As an interior designer, Claire was in her element during those renovations. She'd spend hours scouring antique shops for the perfect fixtures or obsessing over paint swatches until I couldn't tell the difference between soft pearl and eggshell white. But it was worth it to see the house come alive under her touch. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I'd leave for work early, often before Claire even got out of bed. She worked on her projects from home most days, which meant she had the freedom to dive headfirst into her designs without a strict schedule. When I'd get home, we'd share dinner, watch something on TV, and talk about our days. I'd tell her about the latest drama at the office. Engineers are surprisingly gossipy, and she'd regale me with stories of her clients and their sometimes absurd demands. It wasn't flashy, but it was ours. I liked the stability, the predictability of it all. Claire was my anchor, the one constant in a world that often felt chaotic. Then the wall started to sag. It was one of those things we'd been putting off for years, a crack that had grown wider over time until it was impossible to ignore. "This needs a professional," Claire said one evening, pointing at the growing gap near the pantry. I offered to handle it myself. After all, I was an engineer. But she just shook her head, smiling in that way that meant she'd already made up her mind. "Honey, I love you, but this house doesn't need spreadsheets and calculations. It needs someone with a sledgehammer and some creativity." Enter Jack. Claire found him online, a contractor with glowing reviews and a portfolio that she couldn't stop talking about. The first time I met him, I could see why. Jack was the kind of guy who looked like he belonged on the cover of a home improvement magazine. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a friendly grin that seemed tailor-made to put clients at ease. His hands were rough, the kind of hands that spoke of years of hard work. I didn't think much of him at first. Contractors came and went, and I was too busy with work to get overly involved in the renovation process. Claire, on the other hand, was thrilled. "He just gets it," she said one night over dinner, her eyes lighting up as she described his ideas for the kitchen. "It's like he can see exactly what I'm picturing." "Sounds like you found your guy," I said, not thinking twice about the way her face flushed when she talked about him. I barely saw Jack over the next few weeks. Most days, I'd come home late to find the house empty of workers, with Claire excitedly showing me their progress. She'd point out the new cabinets or the freshly laid tile, her enthusiasm contagious. I was happy to see her so invested in something she loved, even if I didn't share her passion for backsplash options. Looking back, I should have noticed the subtle shifts. The way she'd mentioned Jack's name a little too often, or the way she seemed more animated than usual when talking about the renovations. But I didn't. Why would I? Claire was my wife, my partner. There wasn't a doubt in my mind about where we stood. In hindsight, I realize how naive I was. Trust is a funny thing, it's not something you question until you're given a reason to. And at that point, I hadn't been given one. Not yet. It started small. Most things like this do. A month into the kitchen renovation, I came home earlier than usual. Claire hadn't expected me. Usually, I was stuck in rush hour traffic or working late. I walked through the front door to find the house oddly quiet, except for the faint hum of music coming from the back. The kitchen was in its usual state of disarray, drop cloths draped over furniture, tools scattered across the counters. But something felt different. I couldn't place it at first, just a nagging sensation at the edge of my mind. Then I noticed the half-empty bottle of wine on the counter. Claire's voice floated in from the garage, soft and melodic, the kind of tone she used when she was trying to charm someone. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear her laugh, light and unrestrained. A second voice answered her, deep and low. Jack. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. It wasn't unusual for Claire to share a drink with contractors. She liked to make people feel comfortable. But the way her laugh sounded, the way their voices mingled, felt intimate. When I walked into the garage, they both looked up, startled. Claire's cheeks were flushed, her hair slightly disheveled, as though she'd been running her hands through it. Jack leaned casually against the workbench, a confident grin plastered across his face. Oh. You're home early, Claire said, her voice a little too bright. Yeah, I replied, my eyes flicking between the two of them. Thought I'd check on the progress. Jack gave me a friendly nod, his posture relaxed, like he had nothing to hide. Maybe he didn't. Maybe I was just reading too much into things. Still, I couldn't shake the way Claire's voice faltered, the way she avoided my gaze as she busied herself with a pile of fabric swatches on the table. That night, I lay in bed replaying the scene in my mind. Was there something there, or was I imagining it? I told myself I was being ridiculous. Claire was my wife. Jack was just a contractor. There was no reason to think otherwise. But once doubt creeps in, it's hard to push it out. After that evening, I couldn't help but notice things I might have overlooked before. Claire seemed more distracted than usual, her phone glued to her hand at all hours. She was always quick to lock the screen or flip it over when I walked into the room. When I asked who she was texting, she'd brush it off with a vague answer about work or friends. I started paying closer attention. Her routines began to change in subtle ways: longer showers, more time spent picking out her outfits. She had always taken pride in her appearance, but now it felt different, like she was dressing for someone else. The real kicker came one Saturday afternoon. I'd been out running errands and came home to find Claire in the kitchen with Jack. They were standing closer than necessary, their heads bent over a set of blueprints spread across the counter. She laughed at something he said, her hand lightly brushing his arm. I stayed in the doorway, watching. Neither of them noticed me at first. It wasn't until I cleared my throat that Claire looked up, her smile freezing on her face. Oh, hey, she said, stepping back as though putting space between them would erase what I'd just seen. We were just going over some ideas for the pantry. Looks like you're having fun, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. Jack didn't seem fazed. He flashed me that same easy grin and started explaining his plans for the shelving. I nodded along, barely listening. My focus was on Claire, on the way she avoided my eyes and fidgeted with the edge of her sweater. Later, I checked the security camera footage from the garage, the one I'd installed after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood. I hadn't thought much about it before, but now I was curious. I scrolled through the recent recordings, looking for something. It didn't take long to find it. The camera captured Claire and Jack standing by the workbench, their heads close together. At first, it seemed innocent enough, just two people discussing a project. But then Jack reached out, his hand brushing hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, laughing at something he said, her body language open, inviting. I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. It wasn't definitive proof of anything, but it felt like a betrayal all the same. I started keeping a closer eye on things after that. Every glance, every touch, every shared laugh between Claire and Jack became a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. One evening, while Claire was in the shower, I did something I'd never done before. I checked her phone. It felt wrong, invasive, but I couldn't stop myself. Her messages were clean, no incriminating texts or suspicious calls. But it was the absence of anything that bothered me. Claire was always texting someone, her friends, her clients. Yet there was nothing recent, as if she'd gone out of her way to delete everything. I put the phone back and sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. Was I being paranoid? Or was there something she wasn't telling me? Suspicion is like a splinter in your mind, tiny at first, but once it's there, you can't stop picking at it. It burrows deeper, until it's all you can think about. After finding nothing on Claire's phone, I told myself I was overreacting. I wanted to believe her, believe in us, but the doubt wouldn't leave me alone. So, I did what any rational man would do when faced with the prospect of his life unraveling. I got sneaky. The security cameras became my obsession. I told myself I was just being cautious, keeping an eye on the renovations. But in reality, I was looking for something, anything, that would explain the growing distance between Claire and me. It didn't take long to find more footage that set me on edge. Jack and Claire, alone in the kitchen, talking softly, their body language casual but close. I watched the way her eyes lit up when he spoke, the way he leaned toward her as if drawn by some invisible force. They weren't doing anything overtly inappropriate, but the familiarity between them was undeniable. One evening, I came home earlier than expected. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate. I found Claire in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, startled, when I walked in. "You're home early," she said, her voice a little too cheerful. "Yeah," I replied, studying her face. "Thought I'd surprise you." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, it's good to have you home." I sat down across from her, watching as she fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. She was nervous, though she'd never admit it. "How's the renovation coming along?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Good," she said quickly. "Jack's been great, really understands what we're going for." There it was again, that spark in her eyes when she mentioned his name. Over the next few weeks, I started keeping track of her excuses. Late-night meetings with friends. Quick errands that turned into hour-long disappearances. Little inconsistencies that added up, painting a picture I didn't want to see. Then there was the night she claimed she was meeting an old college friend for drinks. I didn't believe her, not entirely, so I decided to follow her. I waited until she left, then grabbed my jacket and slipped out the door. I stayed a few cars behind her, my heart pounding as I tailed her through the streets. She wasn't heading downtown, where most of the bars and restaurants were. Instead, she turned into a residential neighborhood, a place I didn't recognize. She parked outside a modest brick house, her headlights cutting through the darkness. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at the house. Then the door opened, and Jack stepped out. I watched as she got out of the car, her body language hesitant. Jack walked up to her, his hands stuffed in his pockets, and they stood there for a moment, talking quietly. Then he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and she didn't pull away. The scene was like a knife to the gut. I wanted to storm out of the car, confront them right then and there, but I stayed frozen, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I drove away before I could see anything else. My mind was a storm of anger and heartbreak, replaying the image of them together over and over again. That night, I barely slept. When Claire came home hours later, I pretended to be asleep. I couldn't face her, not yet. The next day, I knew I needed proof. I needed something concrete, something I couldn't explain away. So, I did the one thing I'd always thought I'd never do, I installed a hidden camera in the garage. It felt wrong, like a betrayal of the trust we'd built over the years. But if she was lying to me, hadn't she already broken that trust? I told myself it was necessary, that I deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. For days, I watched the footage obsessively. Most of it was mundane, Claire moving tools around, Jack working on the cabinets. But then, one evening, I saw it. The two of them were sitting on the workbench, their heads close together as they talked. Jack reached out, his hand resting on her knee. Claire didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her body language soft, inviting. And then, without hesitation, she kissed him. It wasn't a fleeting kiss. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of kiss that spoke volumes. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. There it was, the proof I'd been searching for. I saved the footage to my laptop, my hands trembling as I clicked through the files. It was a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a hollow sense of validation. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined the distance between us. Claire was having an affair. When the truth finally stares you in the face, there's no preparing for the way it feels. It's like watching a slow-motion car crash, you see it coming, but the impact still knocks the air out of you. I watched that footage of Claire and Jack again and again, each time hoping I'd notice something, anything, that would change the narrative. But there was no misunderstanding what I saw. That kiss wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was intentional, deliberate, and utterly gut-wrenching. The days after my discovery were a blur. I went through the motions at work, barely registering what was happening around me. Meetings became white noise, deadlines meaningless. I couldn't focus on anything except the images burned into my mind, Claire leaning into Jack, her body language so open, so familiar. At home, I tried to act normal, but every interaction with Claire felt like a performance. She'd ask how my day was, and I'd mumble something non-committal, avoiding her eyes. She didn't seem to notice my distance, or if she did, she didn't mention it. I started piecing together the timeline in my head. How long had this been going on? Was it just the renovations, or had it started earlier? Every late-night text, every work dinner, every unexplained absence now felt suspect. I replayed our conversations over the past few months, searching for clues I'd missed. One evening, as Claire was cooking dinner, I casually mentioned Jack. "How's the kitchen coming along?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She glanced over her shoulder, smiling. "Good. Jack says we should be done in a few weeks." Her voice was too casual, too rehearsed. "Jack seems to be over here a lot," I said, carefully gauging her reaction. She hesitated, just for a second, before replying. "Well, he's the contractor. It's his job to be here." There it was, a flicker of something in her expression. Guilt? Nervousness? I couldn't tell, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew. That night, after she went to bed, I sat in the darkened living room, my laptop glowing in front of me. I opened the folder containing the footage, staring at the file names. Each one felt like a weight pressing down on me, a tangible reminder of the betrayal I couldn't escape. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself forever. Sooner or later, I'd have to confront her. But how? The idea of sitting across from Claire, of watching her face as I laid out the evidence, filled me with dread. Would she deny it? Would she lie to my face, even with the proof in my hands? I thought about calling someone, my best friend, maybe, or my brother. But what would I say? "Hey, guess what? My wife's been cheating on me with the contractor." It sounded absurd, even in my head. Instead, I stayed up late into the night, drafting a letter to Claire. I wrote and rewrote it, pouring out everything I was feeling, the anger, the hurt, the betrayal. By the time I was done, it was a jumbled mess of emotions, hardly coherent. I deleted it, frustrated with myself. The next morning, I woke up with a new resolve. If I was going to confront Claire, I needed to do it face to face. No hiding behind letters or texts. I deserved answers, and I was going to get them. That evening, I set the stage. I waited until Claire was settled on the couch, scrolling through her phone. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. She looked up, surprised. "About what?" I walked over to the coffee table and placed my laptop down, the screen already showing the paused footage of her and Jack in the garage. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then back to me. "What's this?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion. "Just watch," I said, hitting play. The room filled with the sound of their voices, the faint laughter, the murmur of conversation. Then came the kiss. Claire's face went pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the couch. "Care to explain?" I asked, my tone colder than I'd ever heard it. She stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. Finally, she looked at me, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's not what it looks like," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I let out a bitter laugh. "Really? Because it looks like you've been sneaking around with Jack behind my back." She started to cry, the kind of deep, heaving sobs that would have broken me once. But now, all I felt was a hollow ache. "It was a mistake," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. "A mistake is spilling coffee. This was a choice, Claire. A series of choices." For a moment, she didn't say anything, just sat there, tears streaming down her face. Then, she looked at me, her expression desperate. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know I hurt you. I know I betrayed your trust. But it didn't mean anything. I love you. Only you." Her words felt like a slap in the face. How could she claim to love me while doing this? How could she look me in the eyes and expect me to believe her? I stood up, pacing the room as she watched me, her tears flowing freely. My mind raced, torn between the anger boiling in my chest and the love I still felt for her. "You need to leave," I said finally, my voice shaking. "What?" she asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I need time to think. To process this. I can't do that with you here." She nodded slowly, gathering her things as the weight of her actions seemed to settle over her. As the door closed behind her, I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. The house felt unbearably quiet, the kind of silence that only comes after something irrevocable has been broken. Claire didn't leave right away. She lingered by the door, clutching her bag, her eyes darting between me and the floor. I sat on the couch, unmoving, my hands gripping the armrest like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. "Where am I supposed to go?" she finally asked, her voice fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. "That's not my concern right now," I said, not even looking at her. Her breath hitched, and I knew she was crying again, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The tears that once had the power to undo me now felt hollow, manipulative. "I'll stay at a friend's," she mumbled after a long silence. I hope we can talk soon. Please don't shut me out." I didn't respond, didn't even look up as the door clicked shut behind her. The sound was both a relief and a blow, the emptiness that followed pressing down on me like a weight. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the dark screen of the television, replaying the night's events in my mind. Her tears, her excuses, her pathetic attempts to downplay what I'd seen, it all churned in my chest, a storm of anger and heartbreak. I wanted to smash something, to scream, to let the emotions out in a way that felt tangible. But instead, I stayed still, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Was this the first time? Was Jack the only one? Had she ever loved me at all, or was I just the safe option, the guy she settled for while craving something, or someone else? Sleep was impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, their bodies close, their lips meeting. It was a loop I couldn't escape. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face the world, not with the mess in my head. Instead, I spent the day gathering every shred of evidence I had: security footage, text logs, receipts. I wasn't sure what I was planning to do with it all, but having it felt like control, like proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Claire called that evening. I stared at my phone as it rang, her name flashing on the screen like a taunt. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, the phone buzzed with a message. "Please, can we talk? I'll do anything to fix this. Just tell me what you need." I deleted it without replying. 3 days passed before I finally agreed to meet her. I told her to come to the house, partly because it felt like neutral ground, partly because I wanted her to see what she jeopardized. When she arrived, she looked small, vulnerable. Her usually perfect hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes were red and puffy, like she hadn't slept any more than I had. She stood in the doorway, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she was still welcome. "Come in," I said flatly, stepping aside. She sat on the edge of the couch, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I stayed standing, leaning against the wall with my arms crossed. "So," I began, my voice cold, "you said you wanted to talk. Start talking." She flinched at the sharpness in my tone but nodded. "I don't even know where to start," she said softly. "How about the truth?" I shot back. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the floor. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she began. "I never meant to hurt you." "Skip the clichés, Claire," I interrupted. "I want details. How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, then whispered, "A couple of months." I clenched my fists, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "So, what? You just decided one day that sneaking around with Jack was worth throwing away 12 years of marriage?" "It wasn't like that," she said quickly, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't about him. It was about me." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, so this is some kind of personal growth thing for you? Good to know." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "I've been feeling lost. Stuck. Like I'm not enough. And Jack, he made me feel seen." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. "And I didn't?" I demanded. She looked up at me, her expression desperate. "You did. You do. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to feel it. I don't know why. I hate myself for it." "Not as much as I do," I muttered. The room fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging heavy between us. I wanted to believe her, to convince myself that this was some temporary lapse in judgment, but the wound was too fresh, too raw. "You said it didn't mean anything," I said finally. "But it sure as hell looked like it did." Claire didn't respond, her silence telling me everything I needed to know. "I can't do this right now," I said, turning away. "I need space. Time to figure out what the hell I want." She nodded, her tears falling silently onto the couch. "I'll wait," she said softly. "As long as it takes. I need you to know that I love you. That's real. That's the only thing I'm sure of." I didn't respond. I couldn't. As she left, the door closing softly behind her, I felt a strange sense of relief. The confrontation was over, but the battle was just beginning. When the door closed behind Claire, the silence in the house became unbearable. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet I used to savor after a long day. No, this was heavy, oppressive, a vacuum where all the warmth and safety I'd once felt had been sucked away. I sat there for hours, staring at the empty couch where she'd just been. Her tears had left dark stains on the fabric, physical reminders of the emotional wreckage she'd left behind. My thoughts churned, spinning through every argument, every plea, every whispered apology. None of it felt real, and yet, it was. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I wandered through the house, touching the things that had once been part of the life we'd built together. The framed photos on the mantel, the throw blanket she always insisted made the couch feel cozy, even the damn backsplash in the kitchen that she'd obsessed over. It was all tainted now, reminders of a love that felt irreparably broken. The next morning, I made a decision. If I was going to make sense of this mess, I needed clarity. And the only way to get that was to separate myself from the emotions swirling around me. I called my boss and requested a week off, citing personal reasons. He didn't ask questions, my voice must have made it clear that I wasn't in the mood for explanations. Then I packed a bag, grabbed my laptop, and drove 3 hours to a cabin I'd rented on the edge of a lake. The cabin was small and quiet, tucked away in the woods where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. It was exactly what I needed, isolation. The first few days were hard. I'd hoped the solitude would bring me peace, but instead, it magnified the emptiness I felt. Every creak of the cabin, every shadow cast by the trees, seemed to whisper her name, pulling me back to the moment I'd seen her with Jack. I tried to distract myself. I went for long walks by the lake, cooked meals I didn't finish, even started a book I couldn't focus on. Nothing worked. The anger and heartbreak clung to me, refusing to let go. One evening, as the sun set over the water, I finally broke. Sitting on the porch with a bottle of whiskey I'd bought on the way up, I let the tears come. They weren't the quiet kind, the ones that slip out unnoticed. No, these were violent, gut-wrenching sobs that left me gasping for air. For the first time since discovering the affair, I let myself feel everything. The betrayal. The anger. The loss. And beneath it all, the love I still felt for Claire, no matter how much I wished I didn't. By the time I returned home, I felt different. Not healed, exactly, but calmer. Clearer. I knew I had decisions to make, ones that would shape the rest of my life. Claire reached out the day I got back. She didn't ask to come over, didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, she sent a simple text. "I hope you're doing okay. I'm here whenever you're ready to talk." I didn't reply right away. Instead, I spent the next few days reflecting on what I wanted. Did I want to try to rebuild what we had? Or was it better to walk away and start fresh? Friends and family weighed in, their advice ranging from "you deserve better" to "people make mistakes, maybe she deserves a second chance." But none of it helped. This was a decision only I could make. When I finally called Claire, I told her to meet me at a park near our house. It was a place we used to go in the early days of our relationship, back when things were simple and love felt easy. She arrived looking anxious, her hands stuffed into the pockets of her coat. I could see the weight of the past few weeks in the lines around her eyes, the tightness of her mouth. We sat on a bench overlooking the pond, the air thick with unspoken words. "I've done a lot of thinking," I began, my voice steady but quiet. "About us. About what happened." Claire nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm not going to pretend this is easy," I continued. "What you did, it broke something in me. Something I don't know if I can ever get back." Her shoulders sagged, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. "But," I said, "I also know that people aren't perfect. That sometimes, even good people make terrible choices." She looked at me then, hope flickering in her eyes. "I'm willing to try," I said. "But only if we're both committed to putting in the work. That means therapy, transparency, and time. A lot of time." Claire nodded quickly, her voice trembling as she said, "I'll do whatever it takes. I swear. I love you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you." I held her gaze for a long moment, searching for sincerity. For the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. It's been 3 months since that conversation. Claire and I are in therapy now, working to rebuild the trust that was shattered. Some days are better than others. There are moments when I feel like we're making progress, like maybe, just maybe, we'll come out of this stronger. But there are also days when the anger and doubt resurface, threatening to undo everything we've worked for. I still don't know if we'll make it. But for now, I'm willing to try. What would you have done in my place? Would you have walked away, or would you have given her a second chance? Write in the comments.